The other recruits couldn't stop staring at her scuffed, worn combat boots during formation that morning. Some snickered behind her back, questioning whether someone who couldn't even afford proper gear belonged in the cockpit of a $60 million stealth fighter. But when violent storms grounded every aircraft at Ramstein Air Base and a critical mission hung in the balance, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Olivia Chen would prove that real experience can't be bought, and that sometimes the most unlikely pilot becomes the only one capable of bringing everyone home alive. Flight Officer Olivia Chen pulled the laces tight on her combat boots for the fourth time that morning, the worn leather creaking softly in the pre-dawn quiet of the barracks. The boots had seen better days, much better days. The black leather was scuffed and faded to charcoal gray in places, with small tears near the ankle that had been expertly repaired with matching thread. Most of the other pilot candidates at Holloman Advanced Flight Training Academy wore gleaming new boots, their leather still stiff and unmarked by experience. At 26, Olivia was older than most of her fellow candidates by 3 to 4 years. Her dark hair was pulled back in the regulation bun, revealing sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her surroundings with the kind of automatic assessment that comes from years of needing to notice things others might miss. While the younger pilots rushed through their morning preparations, talking loudly about weekend plans and civilian lives they'd temporarily left behind, Olivia moved through her routine with methodical precision. Her flight suit was pressed to perfection, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. The name tape above her left breast pocket read Chen in block letters, and beneath it hung a single ribbon, the air medal with 2 oak leaf clusters. Most pilot candidates arrived at advanced training with clean uniforms and empty ribbon racks, their military experience limited to basic training and preliminary flight school. Olivia's ribbon represented 18 months of combat missions over Eastern Europe, flying transport aircraft through contested airspace, where split-second decisions meant the difference between completing the mission and becoming a statistic. She checked her watch, 0530 hours. Formation began at 0600, followed by the morning briefing that would determine flight assignments for the day. Today marked the beginning of the most challenging phase of their training, transition to the F-35A. Lightning II, the most advanced stealth fighter in the world. Out of the 43 candidates who had started the program 6 months ago, only 12 remained. The washout rate was intentionally brutal, designed to identify only those pilots who possessed the rare combination of technical skill, mental toughness, and judgment required to operate the military's most sophisticated aircraft. Olivia opened her personal equipment locker and retrieved her helmet bag, checking to ensure her custom-fitted helmet was secure inside its protective case. The helmet represented thousands of dollars in advanced technology heads-up display systems, night vision integration, and communication equipment that connected the pilot directly to satellite networks and ground control systems. Every pilot candidate was responsible for maintaining their equipment to exacting standards, understanding that mechanical failure at 30,000 feet was rarely survivable. Her flight gloves were tucked neatly beside the helmet, the leather soft from use but without visible wear. Unlike her boots, the gloves were relatively new, purchased with her own money after the standard issue gloves proved inadequate during her previous assignment, flying in cold weather conditions. Small details like proper equipment could make significant differences in performance and safety, lessons she had learned through experience rather than textbook study. The barracks around her began showing signs of increased activity as other candidates started their morning routines. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sounds of showers running, locker doors slamming, and the constant chatter of young pilots discussing technical procedures and aircraft specifications with the enthusiasm of people who had dreamed of this opportunity their entire lives. Olivia had dreamed of it too, but her path to advanced fighter training had been longer and more complicated than most. While her classmates had progressed directly from undergraduate pilot training to fighter training tracks, she had spent 3 years flying cargo, aircraft and operational assignments that tested her skills in ways that peacetime training never could. She had learned to fly in conditions that textbooks said were impossible: severe weather, equipment failures, and hostile environments where mistakes had consequences that extended far beyond personal performance evaluations. Her experience showed in subtle ways that most people didn't notice. The way she instinctively checked weather reports, not just for her departure and arrival airports, but for alternate fields along her entire route. How she reviewed emergency procedures not just for her assigned aircraft, but for every aircraft she might encounter during joint operations. The habit of mentally rehearsing abnormal situations during routine flights, constantly asking herself what-if questions that kept her prepared for scenarios that other pilots hoped would never happen. As she prepared to leave for morning formation, Olivia caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror mounted inside her locker door. The face looking back at her showed the quiet confidence of someone who had already proven herself in situations where proving yourself was a matter of survival rather than career advancement. But she also understood that her previous experience, while valuable, meant nothing in the context of fighter pilot training. Here, she would be evaluated on the same standards as everyone else, and her worn combat boots would be seen as a sign of inexperience rather than the badge of honor she considered them to be. Colonel Marcus Reinhardt stood at the front of the briefing room, his posture rigid with the kind of military bearing that could intimidate junior officers from across a football field. At 52, he commanded the 58th Fighter Training Squadron, with the absolute authority of someone who had spent 30 years in fighter cockpits, accumulating over 4,000 flight hours in aircraft ranging from the aging F-16 Fighting Falcon to the cutting-edge F-22 Raptor. His uniform was immaculate, every ribbon and badge positioned with geometric precision that spoke to both attention to detail and an expectation that others would meet similarly exacting standards. Reinhardt's reputation preceded him throughout the fighter pilot community. He had flown combat missions over 3 different theaters of operation, earned 2 distinguished flying crosses, and was widely regarded as one of the most skilled pilots of his generation. More importantly for the pilot candidates assembled before him, he was known as an instructor who could identify weaknesses and limitations with surgical precision, often within the first few minutes of observing the student's performance in the cockpit. His gray eyes swept across the assembled candidates with the methodical assessment of someone conducting a detailed inspection. Each pilot candidate sat at attention in their assigned seat, flight suits pressed and name tags gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Reinhardt's gaze lingered momentarily on each face, cataloging details and forming preliminary judgments based on years of experience, evaluating young pilots who thought they had what it took to fly fighters. When his eyes reached Olivia, seated in the 3rd row near the center of the room, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The pause lasted perhaps 2 seconds longer than his assessment of other candidates, and those observant enough to notice might have detected a slight narrowing of his eyes as he took in details that others had missed or dismissed as unimportant. Her combat boots, for instance. While other candidates wore standard-issue footwear that reflected either recent purchase or meticulous maintenance, Olivia's boots told a different story. They were clean and properly laced, but the leather showed. The kind of wear that came from extensive use rather than careful preservation. Scuff marks near the toes suggested someone who had spent time working around aircraft in operational environments rather than sterile training facilities. Small repairs along the seams indicated someone who maintained equipment by necessity rather than regulation. To most observers, the boots might suggest inadequate attention to appearance or insufficient resources to maintain proper equipment. But Reinhardt had seen enough combat-worn gear to recognize signs of operational experience when they appeared. What concerned him was not the boots themselves, but what they might represent about their owner's background and the potential complications that could arise when operational pilots transition to the highly structured environment of advanced training programs. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reinhardt began, his voice carrying the crisp authority that characterized all his interactions with subordinates. "Today marks the beginning of your transition to the F-35 Lightning II. Over the next 8 weeks you will be evaluated on your ability to master the most advanced fighter aircraft ever developed. The standards are absolute, the margins for error are zero, and the expectations are higher than anything you have encountered in your military careers to this point." He walked slowly across the front of the room, hands clasped behind his back, making eye contact with individual candidates as he spoke. "Some of you have logged hundreds of hours in trainer aircraft. Some have experience in operational environments flying transport or support missions. A few have even accumulated combat time in less demanding roles. None of that experience, regardless of how impressive it might seem to you, directly translates to the requirements of flying fighters." His gaze returned briefly to Olivia, and this time the pause was long enough for other candidates to notice. Fighter aviation requires a specific mindset, a particular kind of aggressive precision that cannot be taught through textbooks or developed through flying cargo runs. It requires the ability to make split-second decisions while managing multiple competing priorities in an environment where hesitation or second-guessing can be fatal. The colonel moved to the large display screen at the front of the room, which showed a detailed cutaway diagram of the F-35A's cockpit. "This aircraft represents the culmination of decades of technological advancement and billions of dollars in research and development. Every system is integrated, every function is optimized for combat effectiveness, and every capability requires absolute mastery before you will be trusted to operate it independently." He touched a control panel, and the display changed to show performance specifications that made several candidates shift forward in their seats with obvious excitement. Maximum speed, altitude capabilities, weapon systems, and stealth characteristics. That represented quantum leaps over previous generation fighters. Your success in this program will be determined not by your previous experience, not by your personal background, and certainly not by any preconceptions you might have about your own capabilities. Reinhardt continued, his tone carrying subtle emphasis that suggested specific concerns about specific individuals. "It will be determined by your ability to demonstrate the aggressive precision, technological mastery, and tactical thinking that define fighter pilots." As the briefing continued with technical details about aircraft systems and training schedules, Olivia maintained perfect attention, while internally processing the colonel's comments and the way his eyes had lingered on her during his introductory remarks. She understood that her operational experience, rather than being viewed as an asset, might be perceived as potential baggage that could interfere with her ability to adapt to the demands of fighter training. The challenge would be proving that her experience enhanced rather than limited her potential as a fighter pilot, while avoiding any appearance of overconfidence or resistance to instruction. The moment Colonel Reinhardt dismissed the morning briefing, the carefully maintained military decorum of the classroom dissolved into the casual conversations that characterized interactions between pilot candidates when they thought their instructors weren't listening. Olivia gathered her materials methodically, sliding her notebook into her flight bag with the same precision she applied to every task. When she became aware that her name was being mentioned in hushed tones from the group of candidates seated directly behind her. "Did you see those boots?" Flight Officer Jake Morrison whispered to his companion, apparently unaware that sound carried clearly in the nearly empty briefing room. Morrison was 22 years old, fresh from undergraduate pilot training where he had graduated third. in his class and earned recognition as the outstanding graduate in aircraft handling. His boots gleamed with the mirror polish that suggested either obsessive attention to detail or limited actual use in operational environments. "Looks like she bought them at a surplus store," added Flight Officer Sarah Bradley, whose own equipment bore the unmistakable signs of recent purchase and careful maintenance. Bradley had earned her pilot wings just 8 months earlier and had spent the intervening time in training, assignments that prioritize safety and standardization over the kind of improvised problem-solving that characterized operational flying. I mean, seriously, how are we supposed to trust someone to fly a $60 million aircraft when she can't even maintain basic uniform standards? Flight Officer Marcus Webb, who had been listening to the conversation with obvious amusement, contributed his own assessment with the confidence of someone who had never been forced to make his equipment last longer than regulation replacement schedules allowed. Maybe she thinks those boots make her look more experienced or something, like she's been through some real military action instead of just transport flying. The 3 candidates laughed quietly among themselves, apparently finding considerable humor in their assessment of Olivia's appearance and what they perceived as pretensions beyond her actual experience level. Their conversation continued as they gathered their own materials, each comment building on the previous one, to create a narrative about their fellow candidate that was both dismissive and condescending. Olivia finished organizing her materials without acknowledging the conversation taking place behind her, though every word was clearly audible. She had encountered similar attitudes throughout her military career, particularly from junior officers who confused inexperience with competence and mistook shiny equipment for professional capability. The irony was not lost on her that the same boots they were mocking had carried her through 18 months of combat operations where equipment failures and improvised solutions were daily realities rather than theoretical problems discussed. In classroom settings. As she stood to leave the briefing room, Morrison's voice rose slightly, apparently emboldened by the lack of response to their previous comments. "I heard she flew cargo planes in some peacekeeping mission. That's not exactly Top Gun material, you know. Transport pilots are basically flying bus drivers with better uniforms." Bradley nodded emphatically, her expression suggesting complete agreement with Morrison's assessment. "Right, and now she's supposed to compete with us in fighter training? I mean, we've been preparing for this our entire careers. She's just trying to transition from flying boxes around to actually flying real aircraft." Webb's contribution carried a tone of mock concern that was perhaps more insulting than direct criticism would have been. "I almost feel bad for her. She's probably going to wash out in the first few weeks when she realizes that fighter aviation requires actual skill instead of just following flight plans from point A to point B." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Lisa Rodriguez, one of the assistant instructors who had been observing the candidate interactions from the back of the briefing room. Rodriguez was a combat veteran herself with over 200 hours of combat time flying a 10 attack aircraft in support of ground operations. Her presence immediately changed the dynamic of the conversation, as the 3 candidates suddenly remembered that their casual dismissal of a fellow pilot might not reflect the kind of professional attitude expected of future fighter pilots. "Interesting discussion," Rodriguez observed, her tone carefully neutral, but her eyes conveying a message that was considerably less diplomatic. "I trust you all understand that success in this program will be determined by performance rather than equipment appearance or background assumptions." Morrison, Bradley, and Webb exchanged uncomfortable glances, suddenly aware that their conversation had been overheard by someone whose opinion could significantly impact their own progress through the training program. Each of them mumbled appropriate acknowledgments while avoiding direct eye contact with either Rodriguez or Olivia. Captain Rodriguez turned her attention to Olivia, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange. "Flight Officer Chen, a word?" They walked together toward the exit, leaving the three other candidates to contemplate whether their conversation had created professional complications they hadn't anticipated. Rodriguez waited until they were outside the briefing room before speaking, her voice low enough to ensure privacy while maintaining the professional distance appropriate between instructor and student. "I assume you heard that entire conversation," Rodriguez said, her statement carrying the tone of someone seeking confirmation rather than information. "Yes, ma'am," Olivia replied, her response direct and without emotional inflection. Rodriguez nodded, apparently satisfied with both the honesty and the professional demeanor of the response. "How do you plan to handle that kind of attitude from your fellow candidates?" Olivia considered the question for several seconds before responding, understanding that her answer would provide Rodriguez with insights into her character and judgment that could influence future evaluations. "By demonstrating competence rather than defending credentials, ma'am. Performance speaks louder than equipment or background." "Good answer," Rodriguez said, though her expression suggested ongoing concern about the dynamics developing within the candidate group. "But understand that Colonel Reinhardt has very specific ideas about the kind of pilot profile that succeeds in fighter aviation. Your background, while impressive, doesn't necessarily align with his expectations." The warning was delivered with the careful phrasing of someone providing unofficial guidance that could not be acknowledged in any formal evaluation or documentation. Olivia understood immediately that her success in the program would require more than simply meeting technical and performance standards. She would need to overcome preconceptions about her background while proving that operational experience enhanced rather than limited her potential as a fighter pilot. 3 days after the morning briefing had established the underlying tensions within the candidate group, Colonel Reinhardt stood before a much smaller assembly in the advanced briefing room reserved for classified mission planning. Only 6 pilot candidates remained in the accelerated track program, the others having been transferred to standard training pipelines or eliminated entirely based on their performance during initial F-35 familiarization flights. The selection process had been ruthless, designed to identify only those individuals who demonstrated the rare combination of technical skill, adaptability, and mental toughness required for the most demanding assignments. Olivia sat in the front row, her notebook open and pen ready, maintaining the same focused attention that had characterized her approach to every training session. Her fellow candidates, Morrison, Bradley, Webb, along with flight officers David Park and Amanda Torres, displayed varying levels of confidence and anticipation. The past 3 days had established a clear performance hierarchy within the group, with some candidates consistently exceeding standards, while others struggled to meet minimum requirements. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reinhardt began, his tone carrying in gravity that immediately commanded complete attention. "What I'm about to discuss with you is classified at the secret level. You will not discuss these details outside this room, and you will not reference this information in any communication with personnel who lack appropriate clearance levels." He activated the large display screen, which showed a map of Eastern Europe with several locations marked in red. The geography was immediately recognizable to anyone who had been following recent international developments, particularly the escalating tensions along NATO's eastern borders, where military exercises and political posturing had created an increasingly volatile situation. Intelligence reports indicate that a high-value asset is currently located in contested territory, approximately 200 kilometers inside hostile airspace. Reinhardt continued, his presentation delivered with the clinical precision of someone briefing an actual combat mission rather than a training exercise. The asset possesses information critical to ongoing NATO operations and must be extracted within the next 48 hours before the window of opportunity closes permanently. The display changed to show detailed satellite imagery of a remote facility surrounded by mountainous terrain. Anti-aircraft installations were clearly visible, along with what appeared to be several mobile radar systems and defensive positions that would make any rescue attempt extremely hazardous for conventional aircraft. The extraction will require a single F-35A operating in full stealth mode, flying at night through weather conditions that are forecast to be marginal at best, Reinhardt explained. The pilot will need to navigate through multiple layers of hostile air defense systems, locate and communicate with the asset, and provide close air support for the extraction team while maintaining complete electronic silence. Flight Officer Park raised his hand, his expression reflecting the concern that was visible on every face in the room. Sir, what about backup support? Surely a mission this critical would involve multiple aircraft and comprehensive planning? Reinhardt's response carried a tone that suggested the question revealed exactly the kind of thinking that separated successful fighter pilots from those who lacked the mental flexibility required for the most challenging assignments. Flight. Officer Park, real-world operations rarely provide the luxury of optimal conditions or overwhelming force advantages. This mission represents the kind of scenario where a single pilot, operating independently with minimal support, must accomplish objectives that could determine the success or failure of much larger strategic initiatives. The implications of his statement settled over the group like a heavy blanket. This was not a theoretical training exercise designed to test their knowledge of aircraft systems or basic flying skills. This was preparation for an actual mission that would place one of them in a combat environment where mistakes would have consequences extending far beyond personal performance evaluations. The pilot selected for this mission will be chosen based on demonstrated performance during the next phase of training, Reinhardt continued. Over the next 72 hours, you will be evaluated on your ability to operate the F-35A under increasingly challenging conditions. Night flying, weather minimums, electronic warfare environments, and simulated combat scenarios that replicate the conditions you would encounter during the actual mission. Bradley's voice was barely above a whisper when she asked the question that everyone was thinking but no one wanted to voice. Sir, what happens if the pilot selected for this mission doesn't succeed? Reinhardt's expression remained impassive, but his answer carried weight that made the theoretical suddenly very real. Failure would result in the permanent loss of intelligence, assets that could compromise ongoing operations and potentially endanger the lives of hundreds of personnel currently deployed in the region. Additionally, the loss of an F-35A aircraft would represent not only a significant financial cost, but also a potential intelligence disaster if hostile forces gained access to classified technology. The room fell into complete silence as each candidate processed the magnitude of what they were being asked to prepare for. This was no longer about competing for recognition or advancing their careers through successful completion of a training program. They were being evaluated for a mission where failure could have strategic consequences and where the margin for error was essentially zero. Olivia found herself calculating the technical challenges involved in such a mission while simultaneously assessing her own capabilities against the requirements Reinhardt had outlined. Night flying in marginal weather conditions was difficult, but manageable with proper preparation. Operating in hostile electronic warfare environments required specific training and experience that most pilot candidates lacked. The combination of stealth requirements, navigation challenges, and the need to provide close air support while maintaining operational security created a complexity that would test even the most experienced pilots. Your final evaluation flights begin tomorrow at 0400 hours, Reinhardt announced, his tone suggesting that preparation time was limited and the standards would be absolute. Each of you will fly increasingly challenging profiles until one pilot demonstrates clear superiority in the specific skill sets required for this mission. As the candidates filed out of the briefing room, the casual conversations and competitive banter that had characterized their interactions over the past 3 days were replaced by focused concentration and the sobering realization that their Training was about to transition from academic exercise to operational reality. Captain Rodriguez found Olivia in the flight equipment room 2 hours before the scheduled 0400 briefing, methodically checking her helmet systems and reviewing emergency procedures with the kind of systematic thoroughness that separated experienced pilots from those who simply followed checklists. The equipment room was nearly empty at this hour, illuminated only by harsh fluorescent lights that cast sharp shadows across rows of lockers and equipment stations. "You're here early," Rodriguez observed, though her tone suggested approval rather than surprise. She had been watching the candidate dynamics closely since the classified briefing, paying particular attention to how each pilot was preparing for what they all understood would be the most challenging evaluation of their careers. Olivia looked up from her helmet display calibration, her hands continuing their work while she acknowledged Rodriguez's presence. "Yes, ma'am. I wanted to ensure all my equipment was functioning properly before the evaluation flights begin." Rodriguez nodded, moving closer to observe Olivia's preparation process. What she saw reinforced her growing conviction that the other candidates were making a serious error in their assessment of their fellow pilot. Every movement was purposeful and efficient, demonstrating familiarity with equipment systems that went far beyond basic training requirements. The way Olivia tested her helmet's heads-up display integration, checked communication frequencies, and verified navigation system functionality suggested someone who had learned these procedures through necessity rather than classroom instruction. "I've reviewed your service record," Rodriguez said quietly, ensuring their conversation would remain private. 18 months flying C-130 missions over Eastern Europe. Some of those flights were conducted under conditions that most pilots never encounter outside of emergency situations. Olivia paused in her equipment check, understanding that Rodriguez was providing unofficial guidance that could not be acknowledged in any formal evaluation context. "The operational environment taught me to prepare for contingencies that aren't covered in standard procedures, ma'am." "Exactly," Rodriguez replied, her voice carrying conviction that reflected her own combat experience. "And that's something that can't be learned from textbooks or simulated in training exercises. You've already proven you can operate effectively when everything goes wrong and the safety net disappears." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Master Sergeant James Mitchell, the senior enlisted advisor responsible for flight equipment maintenance and pilot support. Mitchell had 24 years of experience maintaining fighter aircraft and had worked with hundreds of pilots throughout his career. His assessment of pilot capabilities was based on observation rather than academic credentials, and his opinions carried significant weight among the instructional staff. "Flight Officer Chen," Mitchell said, approaching their conversation with the respectful familiarity that characterized interactions between experienced military professionals. "I've been reviewing your equipment maintenance logs. You've identified 3 minor discrepancies that other candidates missed entirely during their pre-flight inspections." Mitchell's statement was delivered as factual observation rather than praise, but its implications were clear to anyone familiar with fighter aviation. Attention to detail during equipment inspections could mean the difference between successful mission completion and catastrophic failure, particularly when operating advanced aircraft systems under challenging conditions. "Additionally," Mitchell continued, "your helmet fitting and system integration was completed in half the time required by other candidates, and all your equipment checks were performed to standards that exceed normal requirements. That suggests familiarity with these procedures that goes beyond recent training." Rodriguez and Mitchell exchanged glances that conveyed understanding developed through years of evaluating pilot candidates and predicting their likelihood of success in operational environments. Both had seen promising young pilots fail when faced with real-world challenges, and both had learned to recognize the subtle indicators that distinguish genuine competence from superficial preparation. "There's something else you should know," Rodriguez said, lowering her voice further. Colonel Reinhardt has specific ideas about the pilot profile that succeeds in this type of mission. He tends to favor candidates who demonstrate aggressive confidence and competitive drive over those who display what he considers excessive caution or methodical approaches. The warning was delivered with careful phrasing that avoided any direct criticism of their commanding officer while providing Olivia with insights that could influence her performance during the upcoming evaluations. Rodriguez understood that Olivia's systematic, thorough approach to preparation might be perceived as lacking the aggressive instincts that Reinhardt associated with successful fighter pilots. Mitchell nodded his agreement with Rodriguez's assessment. "But here's what the colonel might not be considering," he added. "This mission requires exactly the kind of careful planning and systematic execution that you've been demonstrating. Aggressive confidence is valuable in air-to-air combat, but this extraction mission demands precision and adaptability under conditions where mistakes can't be corrected through superior firepower or backup support." Their conversation was creating an informal support network that would be crucial during the intense evaluation period ahead. Rodriguez and Mitchell were both positioned to provide guidance and advocacy that could influence the selection process, but their support would need to be demonstrated through Olivia's performance rather than their recommendations. "One more thing," Rodriguez said as she prepared to leave. "Don't let the other candidates' attitudes affect your preparation or performance. Morrison, Bradley, and Webb are talented pilots, but their experience has been limited to controlled training environments. They've never had to make life or death decisions when equipment fails or weather conditions exceed published limitations." Mitchell added his own perspective based on decades of supporting combat operations. "Real missions require pilots who can adapt when the original plan becomes impossible and think creatively when standard procedures don't address the situation they're facing. That's not something that can be taught in a classroom or demonstrated during routine training flights." As Olivia completed her equipment preparation and gathered her materials for the morning briefing, she felt a growing sense of confidence that was based not on comparison with her fellow candidates, but on realistic assessment of her own capabilities. The support and guidance from Rodriguez and Mitchell had provided valuable insights into the selection process and confirmation that her operational experience was indeed relevant to the challenges ahead. The clock on the equipment room wall showed 345 hours, 15 minutes before the scheduled briefing time. Olivia made her final equipment checks and headed toward the briefing room, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether her systematic preparation and operational experience would be recognized as assets or dismissed as irrelevant to the aggressive mindset that Colonel Reinhardt expected from fighter pilots. The F-35A Lightning II sat on the flight line like a predatory bird, its angular stealth geometry creating shadows that seemed to shift and change depending on the observer's perspective. In the pre-dawn darkness, only the navigation lights and ground crew equipment illuminated the aircraft, casting harsh pools of white and red light across the tarmac. Olivia completed her external inspection with the methodical thoroughness that had become her trademark, checking every surface, every panel, and every system that could be visually verified before flight. The morning evaluation flights had been structured as a progressive series of challenges, each designed to test specific capabilities under increasingly demanding conditions. The first flight was scheduled for basic aircraft familiarization and systems integration, conducted in clear weather with full ground support and safety nets. Subsequent flights would introduce complications, degraded weather conditions, simulated equipment failures, electronic warfare scenarios, and finally night operations under conditions that replicated the challenges they would face during the actual extraction mission. Olivia's assigned aircraft, tail number 125044, was configured with full mission systems and advanced sensor packages that would be essential for the extraction mission. The heads-up display, integrated targeting systems, and stealth capabilities represented quantum leaps over the transport aircraft she had flown during her previous assignments. But the fundamental principles of aviation remained unchanged: careful preparation, systematic execution, and constant awareness of changing conditions. Colonel Reinhardt stood near the aircraft with Flight Operations Officer Major Patricia Hayes, reviewing the evaluation criteria that would determine each candidate's suitability for the extraction mission. Their conversation was conducted in low tones, but Olivia could observe their body language and occasional gestures toward the aircraft and weather monitoring equipment positioned around the flight line. The weather conditions were marginal for the scheduled flights, with scattered clouds at 1,500 feet, visibility reduced to 5 miles in morning haze, and surface winds gusting to 25 knots from varying directions. These conditions fell within acceptable parameters for routine training flights, but they would require careful attention to aircraft handling and increased awareness of changing circumstances that could affect flight safety. Flight Officer Chen, Reinhardt called as she completed her external inspection. Your evaluation flight is scheduled to begin in 30 minutes. Are you prepared to demonstrate F-35 at proficiency under realistic operational conditions? Yes, sir, Olivia replied, understanding that the question was testing her confidence as much as her preparation. Aircraft inspection is complete. Mission planning is confirmed, and all systems are ready for flight operations. Reinhardt nodded, though his expression suggested ongoing evaluation rather than approval. Your flight profile will include basic handling characteristics, weapons systems integration, and navigation accuracy under conditions that simulate operational requirements. Performance standards are absolute, and there will be no opportunity for repeated attempts if you fail to meet established criteria. Major Hayes stepped forward, carrying a sealed envelope that contained the specific flight requirements and evaluation criteria. Your mission parameters are classified until you're airborne and have established secure communication with ground control. You'll receive updated instructions based on your performance during each phase of the evaluation. The envelope was handed to Olivia with ceremonial precision that emphasized the significance of what was about to take place. Inside would be waypoints, timing requirements, simulated threat scenarios, and performance standards that would determine her suitability for the extraction mission. Every aspect of her flight would be monitored and evaluated by ground personnel using sophisticated tracking systems that could measure aircraft performance down to inches and seconds. As Olivia prepared for engine start procedures, she became aware that Morrison, Bradley, and Webb had positioned themselves near the flight operations building where they could observe her pre-flight activities and taxi procedures. Their presence was not required for their own flights, which were scheduled for later in the morning, but their obvious interest in her performance suggested they were expecting to witness difficulties that would confirm their assessment of her capabilities. Morrison's voice carried clearly across the flight line despite his apparent attempt to keep his comments private. This should be interesting. Transport pilots aren't exactly known for their aircraft handling skills, especially in anything more challenging than calm winds and unlimited visibility. Bradley nodded in agreement, her attention focused on Olivia's methodical approach to cockpit preparation and systems activation. I heard she's never even flown a high-performance aircraft before this training program. The F-35A is going to be a completely different experience from flying cargo planes in straight lines. Webb added his own prediction with obvious confidence in his assessment. She'll probably be fine with the basic flying, but the weapons systems, integration and tactical scenarios are going to expose her lack of fighter training. There's no way she can compete with us in areas that require real pilot skills. Their conversation was interrupted by the distinctive whine of the F-35's engine spooling up to operating temperature. The sound was unlike anything produced by conventional aircraft, a technological symphony that spoke to the advanced engineering and precision manufacturing that had created the world's most Sophisticated fighter aircraft. Ground crews moved with practiced efficiency, removing safety equipment and preparing to guide the aircraft toward the active runway. Captain Rodriguez appeared at the Flight Operations Building, ostensibly reviewing flight schedules but positioned where she could observe both Olivia's departure and the reactions of the other candidates. Her presence served as a reminder that multiple perspectives were involved in the evaluation process and that informal assessments by fellow candidates would be considered alongside official performance measurements. Olivia completed her engine start checklist and began taxi procedures, maneuvering the aircraft with smooth precision that reflected her familiarity with complex aircraft systems despite her lack of specific F-35A experience. The taxi route to the active runway required navigation around other aircraft and ground equipment, demanding constant attention to clearances and changing conditions that could affect safety. As she approached the runway, ground control provided final weather updates and cleared her for takeoff. The wind conditions had shifted slightly, with gusts now reaching 30 knots, and variable directions that would require careful attention during the critical phases of flight. These conditions were challenging but manageable for experienced pilots, though they would test aircraft handling skills and decision-making under pressure. Lightning 044, you are cleared for takeoff, came the radio transmission from the control tower. Wind 250 at 25 gusting 30, altimeter 30.15, contact departure control on 125.4 after takeoff. Olivia acknowledged the clearance and advanced the throttle, feeling the immediate response of the advanced engine systems as the aircraft accelerated. Down the runway, the F-35A lifted off smoothly despite the challenging wind conditions, climbing rapidly into the morning sky as ground observers tracked its progress and began the detailed evaluation that would determine her suitability for the most demanding mission of her career. At 15,000 feet, Olivia opened the sealed mission envelope and reviewed the evaluation requirements that would determine her suitability for the extraction mission. The flight profile was more complex than she had anticipated, requiring precise navigation through multiple waypoints, weapons systems integration testing, and simulated combat scenarios designed to replicate the challenges of operating in hostile territory. Each phase had specific timing requirements and performance standards that left no margin for error or hesitation. What immediately caught her attention, however, were the weather conditions being reported by automated stations along her planned route. While the departure field had marginal but acceptable conditions, the weather further south was deteriorating rapidly. Embedded thunderstorms were developing along a front that was moving faster than forecast, with reports of severe turbulence, heavy precipitation, and cloud bases dropping to below safe minimums for the type of low-level navigation required by her mission profile. She keyed her radio to contact the evaluating flight controller. Control Lightning 044, I'm reviewing current weather along my planned route and see significant deterioration from forecasted conditions. Request updated weather briefing for waypoints 3 through 7. The response came after a brief delay. That suggested consultation with supervisory personnel. Lightning 044, weather conditions are within acceptable parameters for continuation of your evaluation flight. Proceed according to planned route and timing requirements. Olivia frowned at the response, understanding that the controller was either working with outdated information or had been instructed to minimize weather concerns to maintain the evaluation schedule. Her experience flying transport missions in similar conditions had taught her that automated weather reporting could lag behind rapidly changing conditions by 30 minutes or more, particularly when dealing with convective activity that developed quickly and moved unpredictably. She switched her radio to the emergency weather frequency and listened to pilot reports being transmitted by aircraft operating in the area she would be flying through within the next hour. What she heard confirmed her concerns and amplified them significantly. Commercial airliners were requesting course deviations around severe weather cells. Military cargo flights were experiencing moderate to severe turbulence, and several smaller aircraft had diverted to alternate airports rather than continuing. Through conditions that exceeded their operational limitations. "Control Lightning 044, she transmitted again, her voice carrying professional urgency that reflected genuine safety concerns rather than reluctance to complete her evaluation. "I'm monitoring pilot reports of severe weather along my route. Multiple aircraft are requesting deviations and diversions. Recommend we delay this portion of the evaluation until conditions improve." This time the delay before response was longer. And when it came, the voice belonged to Colonel Reinhardt rather than the flight controller. "Lightning 044, this is evaluation control. Weather conditions are acceptable for mission completion. Fighter aircraft are designed to operate in conditions that challenge lesser aircraft. Continue with your assigned profile." The transmission carried unmistakable authority and a tone that suggested Olivia's weather concerns were being interpreted as reluctance to accept the challenges inherent in fighter aviation. Reinhardt's response revealed his expectation that successful fighter pilots would demonstrate aggressive confidence in their aircraft's capabilities rather than excessive caution about environmental conditions. Olivia understood the position she was being placed in. Continuing with the evaluation flight in deteriorating weather would demonstrate the kind of aggressive determination that Reinhardt associated with fighter pilot mentality. However, her operational experience had taught her that unnecessary risks taken to prove a point often resulted in preventable accidents that served no tactical or strategic purpose. She checked her fuel status, reviewed alternate landing sites along her route, and verified that her emergency equipment was properly configured. If she was going to continue with the evaluation under these conditions, she would need to be prepared for contingencies that the original mission planning had not addressed. Her transport flying experience had included operations in marginal weather, where careful preparation and conservative decision-making had been the difference between successful mission completion and emergency situations. As she approached the first weather area, Olivia could see the towering cumulus clouds that indicated convective activity, far more severe than what had been briefed. Lightning was visible within the cloud masses, and the turbulence was already affecting her aircraft handling as she flew through the periphery of the storm system. The ride was becoming increasingly rough, requiring constant attention to maintain altitude and heading while managing the aircraft's advanced systems. "Lightning 044, contact evaluation control on frequency 134.7 for your next phase instructions," came the radio call that indicated she was being transferred to a different controller, who would manage the weapon systems portion of her evaluation. She switched frequencies and checked in with the new controller, who immediately began providing target information and engagement scenarios that would test her ability to operate the F-35 Ace weapon systems while maintaining navigation accuracy and tactical awareness. The complexity of managing multiple tasks simultaneously while dealing with increasingly challenging weather conditions was exactly the kind of evaluation scenario that would separate pilots capable of operational missions from those who could only perform under ideal circumstances. But as Olivia began the weapon systems evaluation, she noticed something that increased her concern about the wisdom of continuing with the scheduled profile. The weather was not just failing to improve as forecast, it was deteriorating at a rate that suggested the storm system was intensifying beyond the predictions that had been used for mission planning. What had been briefed as scattered thunderstorms with moderate turbulence was becoming a line of severe convective activity that would soon make safe flight impossible for any aircraft, regardless of its capabilities or the pilot's skill level. Her instruments showed wind speeds increasing beyond the F-35I's operational limitations, and the turbulence was becoming severe enough to affect her ability to maintain Precise control inputs required for weapon systems accuracy. These were not conditions that challenged pilot skill. They were conditions that exceeded aircraft design limitations and created safety hazards that no amount of training or experience could mitigate. The first indication that the evaluation flight had transitioned from challenging to dangerous came when Lightning 044 disappeared from ground radar displays during a routine navigation leg between waypoints 4 and 5. The loss of radar contact lasted only 15 seconds, but it occurred precisely as the aircraft was flying through the most intense portion of the storm system that had been developing faster and more severely than any forecasting model had predicted. In the Flight Operations Center at Holloman Air Base, controllers watched their displays with growing concern as weather conditions continued to deteriorate beyond anything that had been considered when the evaluation flights were planned. What had been forecast as scattered thunderstorms with bases at 8,000 feet had become a solid line of severe convective activity with cloud tops reaching above 40,000 feet and documented wind speeds that exceeded the operational limitations of most military aircraft. "Sir, we're losing reliable radar contact with Lightning 044, announced Technical Sergeant Maria Santos, the senior controller responsible for monitoring the evaluation flights. The aircraft is encountering weather that's significantly more severe than what was briefed for this mission." Colonel Reinhardt stood behind the radar displays, his expression showing the first signs of concern about decisions that had seemed reasonable an hour earlier when the evaluation flights had been approved for continuation, despite marginal weather forecasts. The sophisticated tracking systems that normally provided precise location data for all aircraft in the training area were being disrupted by atmospheric conditions that interfered with radar signals and communication systems. "What's the pilot reporting?" Reinhardt asked, though he was already aware that radio communications had become intermittent as Olivia's aircraft moved through areas of heavy precipitation and electrical activity that created interference across multiple frequency ranges. "Last transmission was 10 minutes ago," Santos replied, checking her communication logs. Flight Officer Chen reported severe turbulence and requested permission to deviate around the worst weather areas. She was told to maintain her assigned route and continue with the evaluation profile. Major Hayes, who had been monitoring the weather updates with increasing alarm, approached Reinhardt with current meteorological data that painted a picture of conditions far worse than anyone had anticipated. "Sir, the storm system has intensified dramatically in the past hour. We're seeing wind speeds of 60 knots with gusts above 80, turbulence reports of severe to extreme, and lightning activity that's affecting our ground-based tracking systems." The implications of Hayes' report were clear to everyone in the operations center. The F-35A was an extraordinarily capable aircraft, but it was not designed to operate safely in conditions that exceeded specific environmental parameters. Wind speeds above certain thresholds could cause structural damage, severe turbulence, could result in loss of control and electrical activity, could interfere with the sophisticated electronics that made the aircraft's advanced systems function properly. Reinhardt found himself facing a decision that had implications extending far beyond the evaluation of a single pilot candidate. Ordering Olivia to continue with her assigned mission profile in deteriorating weather would demonstrate the kind of aggressive determination he expected from fighter pilots, but it would also place both pilot and aircraft at risk for no clear tactical or strategic benefit. Calling off the evaluation would be the safe decision, but it would also represent a failure to complete the mission profile that had been established as the standard for selection. "Lightning 044, this is evaluation control," Reinhardt transmitted on the emergency frequency. "Report your current status and weather conditions." The response, when it came, was interrupted by static and atmospheric interference that made communication difficult. "Evaluation control. Lightning 044. I'm encountering severe turbulence and wind speeds that are approaching aircraft limitations. Visibility is near zero and heavy precipitation, and I'm experiencing intermittent electrical interference with navigation systems. Olivia's voice carried professional calm despite the challenging conditions she was reporting, but her message made clear that the aircraft was operating at the edge of its environmental limitations. The sophisticated systems that made the F-35 the world's most advanced fighter were being stressed by conditions that exceeded their design parameters. Lightning 044, can you continue with the evaluation profile? Reinhardt asked, though he was beginning to realize that the question itself revealed poor judgment about the realities of the situation developing around the aircraft. There was a longer pause before Olivia's response, interrupted by several bursts of static that suggested her aircraft was moving through areas of intense electrical activity. Evaluation control. I can continue if required, but I need to advise that weather conditions are exceeding briefed parameters and aircraft operational limitations. Recommend immediate diversion to alternate landing site. The recommendation was delivered with professional courtesy, but its implications were unmistakable. Olivia was informing her evaluators that continuing with the assigned mission profile would place both pilot and aircraft at unacceptable risk, and that safe completion of the flight required immediate changes to the original plan. Reinhardt hesitated, understanding that his response would set a precedent for how similar situations would be handled in the future. Accepting Olivia's recommendation would prioritize safety over mission completion, but it would also acknowledge that his original decision to continue the evaluation flights had been based on inadequate assessment of developing weather conditions. The decision was made for him when the radar displays showed Lightning 044's altitude fluctuating rapidly as the aircraft encountered severe turbulence that was affecting its ability to maintain controlled flight. The F-35A was being subjected to forces that could cause structural damage or loss of control, conditions that transformed the evaluation flight from a challenging test of pilot skills into a potential emergency, requiring immediate action to ensure survival. All aircraft, this is evaluation control. Reinhardt transmitted on the emergency frequency that would reach every aircraft in the training area. Weather conditions have exceeded safe operational parameters. All evaluation flights are terminated immediately. Proceed directly to nearest suitable landing site. The transmission represented acknowledgement that the morning's evaluation flights had been planned and executed with inadequate consideration of rapidly changing weather conditions. More importantly, it meant that the selection process for the extraction mission would need to be restructured around criteria that had not yet been established, and that the 6 pilot candidates would have to be evaluated using methods that reflected the realities of operational flying rather than the artificial constraints of training scenarios. Colonel Reinhardt's order to terminate all evaluation flights immediately created chaos in the operations center as controllers scrambled to establish contact with aircraft scattered across the training area, each facing different weather conditions and operational challenges. The carefully planned evaluation schedule had disintegrated into an emergency management situation, where the primary concern shifted from measuring pilot performance to ensuring that all aircraft and personnel returned safely to base. Lightning 044, this is evaluation control. Technical Sergeant Santos transmitted, her voice carrying the professional urgency that characterized emergency communications. Weather conditions have deteriorated beyond safe operational parameters. You are cleared to deviate from assigned route and proceed direct to nearest suitable landing site. Acknowledge. The response came through heavy static interference that made communication difficult and demonstrated the severity of the atmospheric conditions affecting the aircraft. Evaluation control, Lightning 044. I copy termination of evaluation flights. However, I need to advise that weather conditions between my current position and base are below landing minimums. Recommend I hold current position until conditions improve. Reinhardt moved closer to the radio console, his expression showing the strain of managing a situation that had evolved beyond his original planning and expectations. Lightning 044, what are current conditions at your location? Can you maintain safe flight while holding? There was a pause filled with atmospheric noise before Olivia's response came through the interference. Evaluation control. I'm currently in clear air between weather cells, 15,000 feet. I have adequate fuel for approximately 90 minutes of holding time. However, the storm system appears to be intensifying and expanding, which may limit landing options if conditions continue to deteriorate. Major Hayes was monitoring weather updates from multiple sources, creating a comprehensive picture of conditions. That painted an increasingly concerning scenario. The storm system that had been forecast as scattered thunderstorms was developing into a major weather event that could affect flight operations throughout the region for several hours. Multiple airports were reporting conditions below minimums for safe landing operations. Sir, Hayes reported to Reinhardt, the weather system is moving faster and covering more area than any forecast predicted. We have airports from here to Albuquerque reporting visibility below minimums and winds exceeding safe landing parameters. This is becoming a regional weather emergency. The implications of Hayes' assessment were immediate and serious. If weather conditions continued to deteriorate, aircraft currently airborne might be forced to divert to distant airports outside the affected area, creating fuel concerns and potential emergency situations. The sophisticated F-35A aircraft were designed for combat operations, but they shared the same basic limitations as all aircraft when it came to safe landing requirements. Morrison, Bradley, and Webb had been monitoring the radio communications from the Flight Operations Building, their earlier confidence about the day's evaluations replaced by growing concern about their fellow candidates, who were currently airborne in deteriorating conditions. The reality of operational flying was demonstrating itself in ways that training scenarios had never adequately replicated. Jesus, Morrison muttered, listening to the radio traffic that indicated multiple aircraft were encountering conditions that challenged their operational capabilities. I had no idea weather could change this fast. The briefing this morning said scattered thunderstorms with bases at 8,000 feet. Bradley nodded, her expression showing newfound respect for the complexities of flight operations under real-world conditions. And Chun's been up there for over an hour. She must be dealing with conditions that are way worse than anything we've experienced in training. Webb, who had been the most vocal in his criticism of Olivia's background and equipment, found himself reconsidering his earlier assessments. Transport pilots probably deal with this kind of weather all the time, don't they? I mean, they have to fly scheduled missions regardless of conditions, unlike training flights that can be canceled for safety. Their conversation was interrupted by Captain Rodriguez, who had been coordinating with other flight instructors to track all airborne aircraft and assess the developing situation. Her expression carried professional concern that reflected years of experience managing flight operations under challenging conditions. The weather situation is getting serious, Rodriguez announced to the group of candidates. We have 6 aircraft airborne in conditions that are approaching the emergency criteria. This is no longer about evaluations or training. This is about getting everyone back on the ground safely. As if to emphasize her point, the radio crackled with a transmission from another aircraft that had been conducting evaluation flights in a different area of the training zone. Evaluation control. Lightning 051. I'm encountering severe turbulence and need immediate vectors to alternate landing site. My current position is no longer tenable for continued flight. Flight Officer Park's voice carried stress that was audible, even through the radio static. His aircraft was experiencing conditions that exceeded his training and experience, requiring immediate assistance from ground controllers to navigate to safety. The confident young pilot who had questioned the mission parameters just hours earlier was now seeking help to handle a situation that demonstrated the difference between theoretical knowledge and operational reality. Reinhardt found himself managing multiple aircraft in emergency or near-emergency situations, each requiring individual attention and resources that stretched the capabilities of his ground support personnel. The morning that had begun as a routine evaluation of pilot candidates had become a complex emergency management scenario that tested his own leadership and decision-making abilities under pressure. All aircraft, this is evaluation control. Reinhardt transmitted on the emergency frequency. Weather conditions continue to deteriorate across the training area. If you cannot safely reach your primary or alternate landing sites, declare minimum fuel and we will provide immediate assistance. And priority handling. The transmission acknowledged what everyone in the operations center understood, but had been reluctant to state directly. The evaluation flights had become potential emergency situations where pilot and aircraft survival took precedence over all other considerations. The sophisticated training program designed to identify exceptional pilots was being overwhelmed by environmental conditions that exceeded the planning and preparation that had gone into the day's activities. While ground controllers worked frantically to manage multiple aircraft in distress, Olivia found herself in a unique position among the airborne pilot candidates. Her experience flying transport missions in severe weather had taught her to recognize patterns in storm development and to identify windows of opportunity that might not be apparent to pilots whose training had been conducted primarily under controlled conditions. From her holding position at 15,000 feet, she could observe the entire weather system and track its movement across the landscape below. What she saw confirmed her earlier assessment that the storm was not only intensifying but expanding in ways that would soon make safe landing impossible at most airfields in the region. However, her operational experience had also taught her to look for alternatives that might not be immediately obvious to other pilots or ground controllers. Evaluation control, Lightning 044, she transmitted. Her voice calm despite the deteriorating situation surrounding all airborne aircraft. I've been observing the storm system development from my current position. I believe I can identify an approach route that could allow safe landing at the primary field, but it would require precise timing and navigation through a narrow corridor between weather cells. The transmission created immediate attention in the operations center, where controllers had been struggling to find safe landing options for any of the airborne aircraft. Reinhardt moved to the radio console personally, understanding that Olivia might have information or capabilities that could resolve what was rapidly becoming a crisis situation involving multiple aircraft and personnel. Lightning 044, explain. Your assessment, Reinhardt responded, his tone carrying professional interest rather than the dismissive authority that had characterized his earlier communications. Olivia's response demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking that separated pilots who could operate effectively under adverse conditions from those who could only function when circumstances aligned with their training and expectations. Evaluation control. The storm system has two distinct cells, moving at different speeds. There's a gap between them that will align with the base approach corridor in approximately 20 minutes. The window will last about 15 minutes before the trailing cell closes the gap. Major Hayes was simultaneously tracking the weather system using ground-based radar and meteorological data, confirming that Olivia's assessment was accurate and demonstrated understanding of storm dynamics that exceeded what most pilot candidates learned during standard training programs. Her ability to analyze complex weather patterns from her airborne position suggested experience with operational decision-making that could prove valuable in the current emergency. Lightning 044, can you execute an approach through this weather gap? Reinhardt asked, though he was already aware that attempting such an approach would require exceptional pilot skills and precise timing that left no margin for error or hesitation. Evaluation control. I can execute the approach, but I need clearance to deviate from standard procedures and use tactical approaches that aren't covered in peacetime training regulations. Olivia responded. Additionally, I recommend that other airborne aircraft follow my approach path, using precise timing intervals to take advantage of the same weather window. The request represented a fundamental shift in the command structure that had governed the evaluation flights. Olivia was asking for permission to lead a complex operation that would require other pilots to follow her guidance and trust her assessment of conditions they couldn't observe from their own positions. She was effectively requesting command authority based on her unique combination of experience and current situational awareness. Reinhardt hesitated, understanding that accepting Olivia's recommendation would acknowledge that her operational background provided capabilities that were directly relevant to the current emergency. It would also mean placing the safety of multiple aircraft and pilots under the guidance of the candidate he had previously dismissed as lacking the aggressive instincts required for fighter aviation. The decision was made easier by technical Sergeant Santos, who had been monitoring communications from other aircraft and tracking their fuel status and positions relative to available landing sites. Sir, Lightning 051 and Lightning 047 are both reporting minimum fuel situations. They need landing guidance within the next 30 minutes, or we're looking at potential emergency situations. Lightning 044, you are authorized to execute non-standard approach procedures and provide guidance for other aircraft. Reinhardt transmitted, his voice carrying the weight of command decisions that could determine whether the emergency ended with successful recoveries or catastrophic consequences. All other airborne aircraft will follow Lightning 44's instructions for approach timing and routing. Olivia's response carried confidence that was based on experience rather than bravado. Evaluation control, Lightning 044, I'm beginning descent and approach to take advantage of the weather window. All aircraft should maintain current positions until I confirm successful landing, then follow at 3-minute intervals using the exact approach path I transmit. As she began her descent toward the airfield, Olivia was not just attempting to save her own evaluation flight, she was taking responsibility for the safety of her fellow pilot candidates and demonstrating the kind of leadership and tactical thinking that the extraction mission would require. Her success or failure would determine not only her own future in the program, but also whether her colleagues could safely return to base before fuel exhaustion forced emergency situations that could result in loss of aircraft and personnel. Worn combat boots that had been the subject of mockery and dismissive comments were now carrying a pilot whose experience and judgment had become essential for resolving an emergency that threatened multiple lives and expensive aircraft. The evaluation that had been designed to test aggressive confidence was being resolved through careful analysis, tactical thinking, and a kind of operational expertise that could only be gained through real-world experience under challenging conditions. Olivia's descent through the narrow corridor between storm cells required precision flying that pushed both pilot and aircraft to their operational limits. The F-35A responded to her control inputs with mechanical perfection, but the atmospheric conditions surrounding the aircraft created challenges that demanded constant attention and split-second adjustments to maintain the precise flight path that would allow safe passage through the deteriorating weather. Evaluation control, Lightning 044. She transmitted while managing the complex approach through turbulence that threatened to throw her aircraft off the carefully calculated trajectory. I'm established on the approach corridor. Visibility is marginal but adequate. Experiencing moderate to severe turbulence, but the path is navigable for aircraft following at proper intervals. From the operations center, ground controllers watched her progress on radar displays that showed Lightning 044 threading between weather cells with margins so narrow that any deviation from her planned route would place the aircraft in conditions That could cause loss of control or structural damage. The approach required skills that went far beyond basic instrument flying training, demanding intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior in severe weather that could only be developed through extensive operational experience. Technical Sergeant Santos monitored Lightning 044's approach while simultaneously coordinating with other airborne aircraft to ensure they would be positioned correctly to follow Olivia's path through the weather window. Lightning 051, maintain current position and altitude. You'll begin approach in 8 minutes following Lightning 044's exact route. Lightning 047, your number 3 in sequence. Flight Officer Park's voice carried obvious stress as he acknowledged the instructions while dealing with his own challenging conditions. Copy, Control. Follow 044's approach path exactly. My fuel situation is getting critical. I need to be on the ground within 30 minutes. The pressure of managing multiple aircraft with fuel limitations while navigating through severe weather created exactly the kind of complex operational scenario that separated pilots capable of real-world missions from those who could only perform under controlled training conditions. Each aircraft faced slightly different challenges based on their position relative to the storm system, but all depended on Olivia's successful navigation of the approach corridor that would allow them to reach safety. Colonel Reinhardt stood behind the radar displays, watching Lightning 044's progress with growing recognition that his assessment of pilot capabilities had been fundamentally flawed. The candidate he had dismissed as lacking aggressive fighter pilot instincts was demonstrating exactly the kind of tactical leadership and operational expertise that the extraction mission would require. Her ability to analyze complex conditions and develop solutions under pressure exceeded anything demonstrated by the other candidates during routine training flights. Lightning 044 is approaching decision altitude, announced Major Hayes, monitoring the approach parameters that would determine whether Olivia's navigation through the weather corridor had been successful. If she can't establish visual contact with the runway in the next mile, she need to execute a missed approach and will lose the weather window for all aircraft. The tension in the operations center was palpable as controllers and supervisors realized that the success or failure of Olivia's approach would determine whether all 6 aircraft could land safely, or whether some would be forced to declare emergency fuel situations that could result in catastrophic consequences. The sophisticated training program had become an actual emergency where real leadership and operational skills were being tested under conditions that exceeded anything planned or anticipated. Evaluation Control, Lightning 044. Olivia's voice came through the radio with professional calm that contrasted sharply with the challenging conditions she was navigating. I have the runway in sight. Continuing approach. Weather window is holding as predicted. All following aircraft are cleared to begin approach sequence at previously briefed intervals. Her successful navigation through the weather corridor provided immediate relief to ground controllers and demonstrated that her operational experience had provided skills directly relevant to the current emergency. More importantly, her accurate assessment of the weather patterns had created an opportunity for all airborne aircraft to land safely despite conditions that had initially appeared to make safe recovery impossible. As Lightning 044 touched down on the runway with precision that reflected exceptional aircraft handling skills under challenging conditions, ground controllers immediately began coordinating the approach sequence for the remaining aircraft. Each pilot would need to follow Olivia's exact route and timing to take advantage of the narrow weather window that was already beginning to close as the storm system continued its development. Outstanding approach, Lightning 044, transmitted Colonel Reinhardt, his voice carrying acknowledgement that went beyond routine congratulations for successful flight completion. Clear the runway immediately and stand by for ground control instructions. Lightning 051, You are cleared for approach following 044's exact route. Flight Officer Park began his approach 3 minutes after Olivia's landing, following the precise path she had established through the weather corridor. His aircraft encountered the same challenging conditions, but Olivia's successful navigation had proven that the route was viable for properly executed instrument approaches by qualified pilots. Lightning 051 is established on approach, Park transmitted, his voice showing less stress now that he was following a proven route to safety. Following 044's path exactly. Weather conditions are severe but manageable with proper technique. The success of Park's approach confirmed that Olivia's tactical analysis had been accurate and that her leadership had created a solution to what had initially appeared to be an unsolvable emergency situation. The remaining aircraft followed at carefully timed intervals, each pilot benefiting from the route and procedures that Olivia had developed based on her operational experience and understanding of weather dynamics that exceeded standard training requirements. As the last aircraft in the sequence approached the runway, the weather window that Olivia had identified began closing faster than anyone had anticipated. The trailing edge of the storm system accelerated its movement across the airfield, creating conditions that would soon make even her carefully planned approach route impossible to navigate safely. Lightning 063, piloted by Flight Officer Torres, was encountering deteriorating conditions that threatened to exceed the margins for safe approach completion. Evaluation control, Lightning 063, Torres transmitted, her voice carrying stress that reflected the challenging conditions she was experiencing during what should have been a routine approach following an established route. I'm encountering severe turbulence and wind shear on final approach. Visibility is dropping rapidly, and I'm having difficulty maintaining approach path. From her position on the ground, where she was conducting post-flight procedures and equipment shutdown, Olivia monitored the radio communications with growing concern. Torres was encountering conditions that had deteriorated beyond what the earlier aircraft had experienced, and the approach that had been successful just minutes earlier was becoming dangerous as the weather window closed more rapidly than predicted. Technical Sergeant Santos was coordinating with approach controllers while monitoring weather conditions that were changing minute by minute. Lightning 063, weather conditions are approaching minimums for safe approach completion. Advise if you need to execute missed approach and hold for improved conditions. Torres's response revealed the complexity of the situation that was developing, as fuel limitations intersected with deteriorating weather to create a scenario where all available options carried significant risks. Control, I'm at minimum fuel for missed approach and hold. I need to land on this attempt or declare emergency fuel situation. The implications of Torres's transmission were immediately clear to everyone monitoring the radio frequency. She was trapped in a situation where continuing the approach in deteriorating conditions was dangerous, but executing a missed approach would create a fuel emergency that could force a landing attempt under even worse conditions. The carefully managed recovery sequence was being threatened by weather changes that exceeded all predictions and planning assumptions. Colonel Reinhardt was preparing to authorize emergency procedures that would provide Torres with priority handling and all available ground support when Olivia's voice came over the radio with a proposal that demonstrated exactly the kind of operational thinking that separated exceptional pilots from those who could only follow established procedures. Evaluation control, Lightning 044 requesting permission to launch and provide approach guidance for Lightning 63, she transmitted, her voice carrying professional confidence despite the obvious risks involved in returning to flight in deteriorating weather conditions. The request created immediate discussion in the operations center as controllers and supervisors recognized that Olivia was proposing to place herself back in dangerous conditions to assist a fellow pilot who was facing a potentially catastrophic situation. Her aircraft was on the ground, safe and properly secured, but she was volunteering to return to the hazardous environment she had just successfully navigated. Lightning 044, explain your proposal, Reinhardt responded, though he was already aware that any solution involving additional aircraft in the deteriorating weather would create new risks that could compound the existing emergency rather than resolving it. Olivia's response demonstrated tactical thinking that reflected her transport flying experience, where mutual assistance between aircraft was a standard practice during challenging operations. Evaluation control. I can launch immediately and position above the weather to provide precise navigation guidance for Lightning 063's approach. My aircraft systems can penetrate the weather interference and provide approach information that ground radar cannot. The proposal involved significant personal risk for Olivia, who would be placing herself back in severe weather conditions to assist a pilot she barely knew and who had been among those mocking her background and equipment just hours earlier. The irony was not lost on anyone monitoring the situation that the pilot whose worn combat boots had been the subject of ridicule was now volunteering to risk her own safety to help those who had dismissed her capabilities. Major Hayes was reviewing weather data and approach options while calculating the risks and benefits of Olivia's proposal. Sir, Lightning 044's systems could provide approach guidance that might be more accurate than our ground-based equipment in these conditions, but launching another aircraft in this weather creates additional risks. Reinhardt faced a command decision that would determine not only whether Torres could land safely, but also whether he was willing to accept additional risks to resolve an emergency that had already demonstrated the limitations of his original planning and judgment. Olivia's proposal represented exactly the kind of creative problem-solving and personal courage that operational missions required, but it also placed another pilot and aircraft in jeopardy. Lightning 044, you are authorized to launch and provide approach assistance for Lightning 063. Reinhardt transmitted, his decision reflecting recognition that the current emergency required solutions that went beyond standard procedures and conservative risk management. As Olivia prepared for immediate launch in weather conditions that exceeded normal operational parameters, she understood that she was taking personal and professional risks to assist a fellow pilot who might not have made the same choice if their positions were reversed. Her worn combat boots, which had carried her through 18 months of operational flying, were about to carry her back into dangerous conditions, where her experience and judgment would determine whether both aircraft could return safely to base. The evaluation flight that had begun as a test of individual pilot capabilities was becoming a demonstration of the leadership and mutual support that characterized the most successful military aviation operations. Olivia's decision to launch in deteriorating weather represented exactly the kind of selfless professional courage that the extraction mission would require, proving that true fighter pilot instinct sometimes involved protecting others rather than simply demonstrating individual prowess. Lightning 044 lifted off into the storm-darkened sky for the second time that morning, its advanced systems cutting through atmospheric interference that would have grounded lesser aircraft. Olivia's takeoff was executed with precision that reflected both exceptional pilot skills and intimate familiarity with aircraft performance under extreme conditions. As she climbed through the turbulent air toward her position above the weather, ground controllers tracked her progress while simultaneously monitoring Torres's increasingly desperate situation on final approach. Lightning 063, Lightning 044, is airborne and climbing to provide approach guidance, Olivia transmitted, her voice calm despite the severe conditions she was encountering during the climb. Maintain your current approach path and stand by for precise navigation updates based on real-time weather assessment. From her position at 8,000 feet above the storm system, Olivia could observe the entire weather pattern and identify the exact location of the narrow corridor that remained viable for safe approach completion. Her aircraft's advanced sensor systems penetrated the atmospheric interference, that was degrading ground-based radar, providing navigation accuracy that could guide Torres through the deteriorating conditions. Lightning 063, I have you on my display, Olivia reported, establishing the kind of direct pilot-to-pilot communication that had proven essential during her transport flying missions in challenging conditions. You're currently left of optimal approach path. Turn right heading 092 and descend to 2,800 feet. I'll provide continuous guidance to keep you in the clear corridor. Torres's response carried obvious relief as she received navigation assistance. That was more precise and timely than anything ground controllers could provide through the weather interference. Lightning 044, turning right to 092 and descending to 2,800. Thank you for coming back up here. I was starting to think I wasn't going to make it. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone monitoring the radio communications. Torres, who had been among the most vocal critics of Olivia's background and equipment, was now depending entirely on the guidance of the pilot she had dismissed as unqualified for fighter aviation. The worn combat boots that had been the subject of mockery were now carrying the pilot whose experience and judgment were preventing a potential catastrophe. Lightning 063, you're looking good on approach path, Olivia continued, monitoring Torres's progress while managing her own aircraft in conditions that required constant attention to maintain safe flight. Weather window is holding, but you need to maintain precise heading and altitude. Any deviation will take you into severe turbulence and possible wind shear. Colonel Reinhardt stood in the operations center, watching the radar displays that showed both aircraft navigating through weather conditions that exceeded the operational parameters originally established for the evaluation flights. What he was witnessing represented exactly the kind of tactical leadership and operational expertise that the extraction mission would require, demonstrated by the pilot he had initially dismissed as lacking fighter pilot instincts. Lightning 063, turn left heading 089 to compensate for wind drift, Olivia transmitted, making real-time adjustments based on her observation of atmospheric conditions that were invisible to ground-based tracking systems. You're 2 miles from touchdown. Maintain current altitude until I give you clearance to descend to minimums. Torres followed Olivia's guidance with precision, her aircraft responding to the navigation updates that kept her in the narrow corridor of safe air between storm cells that were continuing to intensify and close together. The approach that had seemed impossible just minutes earlier was becoming manageable through the kind of direct pilot assistance that could only be provided by someone with operational experience in similar conditions. Lightning 044, I have the runway in sight, Torres announced, her voice carrying gratitude that extended far beyond routine professional courtesy. Continuing approach. Your guidance was perfect. I never could have found this approach path without your help. As Lightning 063 touched down safely on the runway, completing the successful recovery of all 6 aircraft, despite weather conditions that had exceeded every forecasting prediction, the operations center erupted in expressions of relief that reflected the magnitude of the emergency that had been successfully resolved. What had begun as routine evaluation flights had become a complex crisis that tested every aspect of pilot capabilities and command decision-making. Outstanding work, Lightning 044, Colonel Reinhardt transmitted, his voice carrying acknowledgement. That went far beyond routine congratulations. Your leadership and operational expertise prevented what could have been a catastrophic situation. All aircraft are safe on deck thanks to your guidance and tactical thinking. Olivia's response was characteristically professional and modest, reflecting the operational mindset that prioritized mission completion over personal recognition. Evaluation control, Lightning 044, just doing what the situation required. Requesting clearance to land and terminate flight operations. As she descended through the storm for her second landing of the morning, Olivia understood that the evaluation process had been fundamentally transformed by the day's events. The aggressive confidence that Colonel Reinhardt had initially sought in fighter pilot candidates had proven less valuable than the operational experience and tactical judgment that enabled effective performance under real-world conditions that exceeded training scenarios. Her worn combat boots, which had carried her through 18 months of operational flying, and now through a morning that had tested every aspect of her pilot capabilities, had become symbols of experience rather than inadequacy. The evaluation that was supposed to measure fighter pilot potential had instead demonstrated that true military aviation excellence came from the ability to adapt, lead, and sacrifice for others when circumstances demanded extraordinary performance under impossible conditions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.